All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try to unpack something that I think we hear a lot about, but maybe don't always have a super strong grasp on, and that is presidential use of tariffs in the U.S.
Yeah, tariffs, always a hot button issue.
Always.
Uh-huh.
And I think especially over the last few years, there's been so much discussion and debate, some of it pretty heated, about tariffs, and sometimes it feels like we're missing that crucial historical context,
Really?
to really understand what's happening now. So that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive today. We've gathered a ton of information from different sources, and our mission, if you will, is to really explore why U.S. presidents have turned to tariffs throughout history, and maybe even more importantly, what happened as a result of those tariffs. Like, what were the consequences, both good and bad?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think sometimes when we talk about tariffs today, we forget they're not a new thing at all. I mean,
Yeah.
they've been a tool that American presidents have used since the very beginning of the country. So by taking a look back, we can really gain some valuable perspective on, like you said, the current debates, and maybe even get some insight into where things might be headed.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start at the very beginning. I think it might surprise some people to know that, back in the early days of the United States, tariffs were crucial, even before we had federal income taxes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, tariffs were the main way the federal government funded itself. But it wasn't just about bringing in money. There was a whole strategic side to it, too. Like, think about Alexander Hamilton. He was a huge advocate for using tariffs to actually protect young American industries.
Interesting. So it's like giving them a little bit of a boost, a leg
Yeah.
up to help them get started.
Exactly. The idea was that if you make imported goods more expensive, then American-made goods would seem more appealing, and it would give those new businesses a chance to grow without being crushed by competition from, more established European companies. They called them protective tariffs.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So it wasn't just about filling the government's pockets, it was also about intentionally shaping the whole U.S. economy.
Right, spot on. And that's actually written into the Constitution. Congress has the power to set taxes on imports to do just that, to create a space where American industries can get a foothold and thrive.
And that brings us to the 19th century. As the country was developing, it sounds like tariffs were a big deal, a really central issue, and not always without controversy. I mean, when I think about the 19th century and tariffs, the first thing that pops into my head is the Tariff of Abominations.
Yeah, the Tariff of 1828. It's a perfect example of how tariffs could be pretty divisive. I mean, they jacked up the taxes on imported goods so high, and it ended up hitting different parts of the country in very different ways.
Oh, so.
Well, the South was really unhappy about it. Their economies were all about exporting agricultural products like cotton and then importing manufactured goods. So these high tariffs felt like they were basically benefiting the industrial North at the South's expense.
Ah, so it created some regional tension, almost like an economic rivalry.
Exactly. It actually led to the nullification crisis, where South Carolina basically said, hey, we don't think states have to follow federal laws they believe are unconstitutional, and this tariff is one of them. It shows how tariffs, even though they were meant to help the whole country, could also spark some serious disagreements.
Wow, so these early tariffs really highlight how intertwined economics and politics have always been in the U.S.
Totally. And it's important to remember that for a big chunk of the 19th century, tariffs were the main source of income for the federal government. So they were constantly shaping the political landscape and driving all sorts of debates about economic policy.
Okay, so we've got this background of tariffs being used for both revenue and protectionism. And then, of course, we come to a period that I think is really often brought up when people are talking about the potential dangers of tariffs. The time leading up to the Great Depression and the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, it seems like a real turning point.
Yeah, Smoot-Hawley is kind of a cautionary tale. It's crucial to understand the context, though.
Yeah.
The U.S. was already in a major economic slump, and the thinking at the time was, okay, we need to shield American jobs and businesses from foreign competition. So they went ahead and slapped huge tariffs on imports, some of the highest in U.S. history.
So the idea was to protect the American economy by making foreign goods more expensive.
Yeah, that was the logic. The problem is, most economists now agree that Smoot-Hawley actually backfired, like big time. It made the Great Depression worse, and it dragged it out longer.
That seems kind of counterintuitive. I mean, if you try to protect American jobs, how could that end up hurting the economy so badly?
Well, even back then, the world's economy was already pretty interconnected. When the US raised tariffs, other countries retaliated. They put their own tariffs on American products, especially agricultural goods.
Oh, so like a tit-for-tat trade war.
Yeah, pretty much. And international trade just took a nosedive. American farmers who relied on selling their crops overseas lost their markets. Plus, industries here that needed imported raw materials had to pay a lot more. Smoot Hawley is a prime example of how protectionism, even if well-intentioned, can spiral out of control and damage everyone, including the country that started it. Imports and exports in the U.S. both plummeted like crazy.
It sounds like the fallout from Smoot-Hawley was a real wake-up call. Did it lead to a major change in how the U.S. approached trade policy?
Absolutely. The Reciprocal Tariff Act of 1934 was a big shift away from that go-it-alone protectionism. It gave the president the power to negotiate trade deals with other countries, where both sides would agree to lower their tariffs. So instead of just putting up walls, the U.S. started to recognize the benefits of working together and opening up trade more freely.
So, more cooperation, less going it alone. But even though the trend overall shifted towards lower tariffs after that, it doesn't mean that presidents completely stopped using them, right?
No, not at all. Tariffs were still there in the toolbox, so to speak, and presidents continued to use them, but usually for more specific strategic reasons. In recent decades, we've seen tariffs being used to protect things like national security or to address what are seen as unfair trading practices by other countries, or even as a way to try to shrink trade deficits.
Right, okay. Which brings us to some of the tariffs that were imposed in the mid-2020s, which I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with. What were the main arguments for putting those tariffs in place?
The stated goals, they were often about making America more competitive, protecting American jobs and industries, and strengthening our national security, both in terms of defense and our economy. There was this idea that some countries were engaging in trade practices that were hurting American companies, like stealing intellectual property or dumping cheap goods on the market. And tariffs were presented as a way to fight back and encourage more production here at home.
And what about the impact of these more recent tariffs? I feel like there's been a lot of debate about how they've actually affected the U.S. and the global economy.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of opinions on that. But if we look at what the analyses show, a few things stand out. One clear impact has been higher prices for American consumers and businesses. If you're importing goods, either finished products or parts to make things here, those tariffs mean higher costs.
And those costs get passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices.
Right. Exactly. And we've also seen some changes in those global supply chains we talked about earlier, with companies trying to find ways around the tariffs, maybe sourcing materials from different countries or shifting production. As for whether these tariffs actually achieved what they set out to do, that's where the opinions really diverge. Some folks say, yeah, some American industries got a boost, but others point out that overall trade actually went down, which could potentially hurt economic growth. And what's really interesting is how many people have compared these recent tariffs to Smoot-Hawley. It's like that whole historical episode is a big flashing warning sign about the risks of starting trade wars and the potential for things to backfire.
It definitely highlights how complex this whole issue is. You can't just say tariffs are good or bad. It all depends on the context, right?
100%. And there's always this tension between trying to protect certain industries and the potential downsides for everyone else. I mean, even if the goal is to help specific companies or workers, those tariffs can end up costing consumers and other businesses a lot of money. And then there's always the chance that other countries will retaliate, which could hurt businesses that rely on exports. The global economy is so intertwined that you pull on one thread, and it can have ripple effects all over the place.
So as we wrap up our look at how U.S. presidents have used tariffs throughout history, what are the biggest takeaways?
Well, I think it's clear that tariffs have been a constant in American history, going all the way back to the founding of the country. They started out as the main way to fund the government and help new industries get on their feet. But after that disastrous experience with Smoot-Hawley during the Great Depression, things started to change. The U.S. moved towards more open trade and started making deals with other countries to lower tariffs together. More recently, though, we've seen a bit of a resurgence in using tariffs, often with the goal of protecting American interests in a globalized world.
And as we've seen, figuring out whether those tariffs were successful or not is rarely simple. There are arguments on both sides, and we have to consider the long-term effects as well as the immediate impact.
Definitely. And I think that leaves us with a really important question to think about. Given all this history, what are the key lessons we should keep in mind when we're evaluating tariff policies, whether they're happening now or being proposed for the future? Especially as the world becomes even more interconnected, how do we balance those potential benefits for specific parts of the economy with the broader economic consequences and, the very real risk of triggering trade conflicts with other countries? I think it's crucial to look at the motivations behind tariffs, both historically and today, and to really weigh the evidence of what those tariffs actually achieved, both the good and the bad, so we can make informed decisions about these complex issues.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Lots to think about. So for all of you listening, keep that question in mind as you navigate this complex world of tariffs and trade. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.